The Texas sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple as Carlos tucked Sophia into bed. "Sleep tight, mi amor," he whispered, kissing her forehead. Sophia, all of 7 years old, clutched her stuffed bunny close. "Papa, will you read me another story tomorrow?" Carlos smiled, his heart swelling. "Of course, Princessa. Anything for you." He worked tirelessly at a construction site, his hands calloused, but his spirit unbroken. Every extra dollar went towards Sophia, new shoes, school trips, and the occasional sweet treat. He was her world, and she was his. Their small house, though humble, was filled with love and laughter. Pictures of Sophia's drawings adorned the refrigerator, and the scent of Carlos's famous chicken enchiladas often filled the air. They were a team, navigating life together after Sophia's mother had left years ago. Carlos had DACA, deferred action for childhood arrivals, which allowed him to work and live in the United States without fear of deportation. It was a lifeline, a shield against the uncertainty that haunted many immigrants. He paid his taxes, obeyed the laws, and contributed to his community. He believed he was safe, building a future for himself and his daughter. He had no idea that the peace he cherished was about to be shattered, that a single phone call would unravel everything he had worked so hard to achieve. A shadow of fear, unnoticed, began to creep toward their doorstep. The shattering began a few weeks later. Carlos was awakened by a loud crash downstairs. His heart leaped into his throat. He bolted upright, fear gripping him. Sophia was sound asleep in the next room. He had to protect her. He grabbed a baseball bat he kept by the bed, his hand trembling. He crept to the top of the stairs, listening intently. He could hear muffled voices and the sound of things being thrown around. Burglars. In his house. He considered his options. He could try to fight them, but he was outnumbered, and his priority was Sophia's safety. He quietly backed away from the stairs and pulled out his phone. His fingers fumbled as he dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher asked. Someone's breaking into my house. Carlos whispered, his voice tight with fear. He gave his address and described what he was hearing. The dispatcher assured him that the police were on their way. He huddled with Sophia in her room, barricading the door with a dresser. He tried to reassure her, but his own fear was palpable. The wait felt like an eternity. Finally, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they approached. He felt a surge of relief. Help had arrived. Little did he know, calling for help would set in motion a chain of events that would threaten everything he held dear. The police apprehended the burglars quickly. They were young, scared, and clearly desperate. Carlos, still shaken, answered their questions, providing all the information he could. He trusted them. They were there to protect him and his community. He showed them his DACA card, explaining his status and his commitment to following the law. The officers seemed understanding, even sympathetic. They assured him that everything was going to be all right. What Carlos didn't know was that, unbeknownst to him, his information was being entered into a database that automatically shared data with ICE. It was standard procedure, they would later claim. He was never informed that his details would be shared, never given a choice. Meanwhile, deep within the digital labyrinth of government databases, a glitch occurred. A routine system update triggered a cascade of errors, and Carlos's DACA status was mistakenly flagged as revoked. The error was subtle, almost invisible, but its consequences would be devastating. The system flagged him due to an accidental overlap in his name and another individual who had their DACA status revoked for a completely different reason. The two records were briefly linked, and the automated system registered the revocation across both files. The human oversight that could have corrected this never happened. It was a silent, ticking time bomb waiting to explode. He had unknowingly become a target, a pawn in a system riddled with flaws. A few weeks later, Sophia was drawing at the kitchen table, carefully coloring a picture of a bright yellow sun. Carlos was getting ready for work, humming a cheerful tune. The morning felt ordinary, deceptively so. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the house. Carlos frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. He opened the door to find two ICE agents standing on his porch, their faces grim. Carlos Rodriguez, One of them asked, his voice cold and official. Carlos nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. Yes, that's me. We have a warrant for your arrest, the agent said, holding up a document. Your DACA status has been revoked. Carlos felt the world tilt. That's not possible, he stammered, his voice trembling. I have DACA. I have the papers to prove it. According to our records, your DACA has been terminated, the agent replied, unmoved. You are to come with us. Sophia, hearing the commotion, ran to her father's side, clutching his leg. Papa, what's happening? She cried, her eyes wide with fear. It's okay, mi amor, Carlos said, trying to reassure her, though his own fear was overwhelming. Everything will be all right. But he knew, deep down, that everything was far from all right. As they led him away, Sophia's screams pierced the morning air, a sound that would haunt him forever. He kept repeating, "It's a mistake, it's a mistake." But his words seemed to vanish into the uncaring morning breeze. He was being taken away from his daughter, and he was helpless to stop it. The detention center was cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the warmth and love of his home. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind him, echoing the finality of his situation. He was stripped of his belongings, given an orange jumpsuit, and assigned a bunk in a crowded cell. Fear gnawed at him. He thought of Sophia, alone and scared. Who was taking care of her? Was she eating? Was she sleeping? The uncertainty was agonizing. He had to get back to her. He learned quickly that hope was a rare commodity within those walls. The other detainees were a mix of faces, each etched with their own stories of hardship and desperation. Some were hardened criminals. Others were simply victims of circumstance, caught in the web of immigration laws. Carlos clung to the belief that this was all a mistake, a bureaucratic error that could be easily rectified. He requested a lawyer, his voice barely a whisper in the cavernous room. He explained his situation, showed copies of his DACA paperwork to anyone who would listen. Days turned into weeks. Each day was a battle against despair, a constant struggle to maintain hope. He wrote letters to Sophia in his head, promising her that he would be home soon. He imagined her reading them, her face lighting up with joy. These mental letters were his lifeline, his connection to the world outside. He knew he had to fight, not just for himself, but for Sophia, for their future together. He had to prove that he wasn't a criminal, that he was a father who deserved to be with his daughter. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Carlos met with his lawyer, Elena Ramirez. She was a small woman with a fierce determination, her eyes burning with a passion for justice. She listened intently to Carlos's story, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This is outrageous, Carlos," she said, her voice filled with indignation. "A system error? Sharing information with ICE without your consent? We're going to fight this." Elena explained their strategy. First, they needed to prove that the DACA revocation was a mistake, a glitch in the system. This meant gathering documentation, contacting government agencies, and navigating a labyrinth of bureaucratic red tape. Second, they would argue that Carlos's rights had been violated, that he had been unfairly targeted and detained. Elena visited Sophia, now staying with Carlos's sister, Isabella. Sophia was withdrawn and quiet, her bright spirit dimmed by her father's absence. Elena promised Sophia that she would do everything she could to bring her father home. Elena became Carlos's advocate, his voice in a system that seemed determined to silence him. She worked tirelessly, poring over documents, making phone calls, and building a case that would expose the injustice of Carlos's situation. She knew that time was of the essence. Every day that Carlos spent in detention was a day stolen from Sophia, a day that chipped away at their future. She was determined to win, not just for Carlos, but for every immigrant who had been unfairly targeted by a broken system. She saw Carlos's case as a symbol, a fight for fairness and humanity in a world that often seemed to lack both. Isabella, heartbroken by her brother's detention and seeing Sophia's suffering, reached out to a local community organization that supported immigrant families. They, in turn, contacted a local news outlet. Soon, Carlos's story began to spread like wildfire. People were outraged. How could a man who had called for help, who had DACA, who was a loving father, be treated this way? Petitions were launched, protests were organized, and social media exploded with support for Carlos. Neighbors who had known Carlos for years spoke of his kindness and his unwavering dedication to Sofia. Teachers described Sofia as a bright and well-behaved student, now struggling with her father's absence. Activists rallied, demanding justice for Carlos and calling for an end to the sharing of information between local police and ICE. The protests grew larger, attracting media attention from across the state. People held signs that read, "Free Carlos," and "Families belong together." They chanted slogans, demanding that ICE release Carlos and correct the error in his DACA status. Elena, with the help of the community organization, organized a press conference. Sofia, holding a drawing of her and her father, stood bravely beside her aunt. Isabella spoke passionately about her brother's character and the devastating impact of his detention on Sofia. Elena reiterated the legal arguments and called on the authorities to act swiftly to rectify the injustice. The community was speaking with one voice, demanding that Carlos be freed and reunited with his daughter. The pressure was mounting, but the fight was far from over. Sofia's world had shrunk. The laughter and joy that once filled their small house had been replaced by a heavy silence. She missed her father's bedtime stories, his warm hugs, and the way he always knew how to make her smile. Isabella tried her best to fill the void, but she couldn't replace Carlos. Sofia refused to eat her favorite chicken enchiladas, saying they didn't taste the same without Papa. She started having nightmares, waking up screaming for her father, reliving the moment he was taken away. "She keeps asking when Papa is coming home," Isabella said, her voice choked with emotion. "I don't know what to tell her anymore. I just tell her he's working far away, but she's smart. She knows something's wrong." Sofia's teacher noticed a change in her behavior. She was withdrawn, struggling to concentrate in class, and often burst into tears for no apparent reason. Her grades were slipping, and her bright spark seemed to have faded. "She used to be so enthusiastic about learning," her teacher said. "Now, she just seems lost and afraid." Sofia started carrying around a small photo of her and her father, clutching it tightly wherever she went. It was her connection to him, a reminder of the love and security she had lost. At night, she would whisper stories to the photo, pretending that her father was listening. "Papa," she would say, "I miss you so much. Please come home soon. I promise I'll be a good girl." Her innocent words were a heartbreaking reminder of the human cost of Carlos's detention, a stark illustration of the devastating impact of immigration policies on children. The community's fight for Carlos was not just about him. It was about protecting Sofia, about giving her back the father she so desperately needed. Elena faced an uphill battle. Proving the system error was like chasing a ghost. Government agencies were slow to respond, and documents were buried in layers of bureaucracy. She had to navigate a complex legal system, fighting against powerful forces that seemed determined to deport Carlos. Her primary argument was that Carlos's DACA status was valid and that the revocation was a result of a clerical error. She presented copies of his DACA approval notices, his work permits, and his tax returns, demonstrating his compliance with the program's requirements. She also argued that the sharing of Carlos's information between the local police and ICE violated his rights. She argued that it created a chilling effect, discouraging immigrants from reporting crimes and cooperating with law enforcement. The government, however, maintained that their systems were accurate and that Carlos's DACA had been legitimately revoked. They presented their own set of documents, claiming that they showed a discrepancy in Carlos's application. Elena suspected that they were deliberately obfuscating the truth, trying to cover up their mistake. She filed a motion demanding access to the government's internal records, hoping to uncover the evidence that would prove the system error. The legal proceedings dragged on, each hearing a tense battle of wits and legal arguments. Elena fought tirelessly, challenging the government's claims, presenting evidence, and arguing for Carlos's release. The stakes were high. If she lost, Carlos would be deported, separated from Sofia, and his life would be shattered. She knew she had to win, not just for Carlos, but for all those who had been victimized by a flawed and unjust system. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her shoulders. After weeks of relentless effort, Elena received a breakthrough. A junior programmer within the Department of Homeland Security, moved by Carlos's story after seeing it on the news, anonymously contacted Elena. He provided her with a snippet of code that confirmed the system error, the accidental linking of Carlos's file with another individual who had their DACA revoked. It was the smoking gun they needed. Elena immediately filed a motion to present the new evidence to the court. The judge, a stern but fair woman named Judge Thompson, agreed to hear the motion. Judge Thompson had been following the case closely, and the outpouring of public support for Carlos had not gone unnoticed. The news of the new evidence spread quickly, igniting a fresh wave of hope within the community. Sofia, for the first time in weeks, smiled. "Papa is coming home," she whispered, clutching her photo. Carlos, hearing the news from Elena during a brief phone call, felt a surge of elation. He allowed himself to imagine holding Sofia again, reading her bedtime stories and watching her laugh. But he knew better than to get his hopes up too high. He had learned that the system was unpredictable and that anything could happen. The days leading up to the hearing were filled with a mix of hope and anxiety. Carlos and his supporters were on an emotional roller coaster, swinging between optimism and despair. They knew that the hearing would be a defining moment, a turning point that would determine Carlos's fate. The hope was a fragile thing, easily shattered. They held their breath, praying for a miracle. The courtroom was packed. Supporters, activists, and members of the media filled every seat. Outside, a crowd gathered, holding signs and chanting slogans, their voices echoing through the city streets. The air was thick with anticipation. Carlos, dressed in his orange jumpsuit, sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He avoided eye contact with the gallery, his gaze fixed on Judge Thompson. He could feel Sofia's presence in his heart, a constant reminder of what he was fighting for. Elena presented her case, methodically laying out the evidence, including the code snippet provided by the anonymous programmer. She argued that the government had acted negligently, that they had violated Carlos's rights, and that they had caused irreparable harm to him and his daughter. The government lawyer countered, arguing that the code snippet was unreliable and that Carlos had not been harmed by their actions. He painted Carlos as someone who was trying to exploit the system, someone who did not deserve to be in the United States. Judge Thompson listened intently, her expression unreadable. She asked pointed questions of both sides, probing for weaknesses in their arguments. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. After hours of testimony and legal arguments, Judge Thompson called a recess. Everyone waited with bated breath, knowing that the judge's decision would determine Carlos's future. When she returned, the courtroom fell silent. Judge Thompson cleared her throat and began to speak. Her words hung in the air, each syllable carrying the weight of Carlos's fate. The fate of a father, the fate of a daughter, the fate of a community. This was the moment of truth. The silence was deafening. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, and with due regard for the arguments made by both sides, this court finds in favor of the defendant, Carlos Rodriguez. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Carlos closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. He was free. The court finds that the government acted negligently in flagging Mr. Rodriguez's DACA status as revoked. The evidence clearly demonstrates that this was a result of a system error, and that Mr. Rodriguez has at all times been in compliance with the requirements of the DACA program. Furthermore, Judge Thompson continued, this court finds that the sharing of Mr. Rodriguez's information with ICE, without his knowledge or consent, violated his rights and created a chilling effect that discourages immigrants from seeking assistance from law enforcement. This practice must cease immediately. The courtroom erupted in cheers. People hugged, cried, and celebrated. Elena beamed, her eyes shining with triumph. She had won. Carlos was quickly released from custody. As he walked out of the courthouse, he was greeted by a throng of supporters, chanting his name and waving signs. But his eyes were searching for one person. And then he saw her. Sophia. She ran towards him, her face radiant with joy. "Papa!" she cried, leaping into his arms. Carlos held her tight, burying his face in her hair. "Mi amor," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm home. I'm finally home." They were together again, their nightmare finally over. But the scars of the experience would remain, a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. The system had failed them, but love and community had prevailed. The road to recovery was long and arduous. Sophia still had nightmares, and Carlos struggled with the trauma of his detention. They both flinched at the sound of sirens and hesitated before trusting anyone in uniform. But they were together, and that was all that mattered. Carlos returned to his job at the construction site, grateful for the support of his co-workers. Sophia slowly began to regain her confidence in school, her bright spark rekindled by her father's presence. Elena continued to fight for immigration reform, using Carlos's case as an example of the injustices that plague the system. She worked with community organizations to advocate for policies that would protect immigrant families and prevent similar situations from happening in the future. Carlos became an advocate himself, sharing his story at community events and speaking out against the sharing of information between local police and ICE. He wanted to ensure that no other family would have to endure what he and Sophia had gone through. "It's not right," he said, his voice filled with passion. "We should be able to call for help without fearing deportation. We should be able to live our lives without fear." Their experience had changed them, but it had also strengthened their bond. They had faced adversity and emerged stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever to fight for justice and equality. Years later, Sophia graduated from high school, valedictorian of her class. Carlos watched her proudly, tears welling up in his eyes. He had overcome so many obstacles to provide her with a better life, and now she was ready to embark on her own journey. Their story became a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of love, community, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The fight for immigration reform continued, but Carlos and Sophia knew that they had already won the most important battle, the battle for their family.